Our assignment for this episode is the autobiography of John Stuart Mill, which was written intermittently throughout his life, but for reasons of discretion, it was not published till a few months after his death at the age of 66 in 1873. And it's a very paradoxical book. It's the confessions of a deeply repressed person who kind of knows that he's a deeply repressed person, I think. It's a paradoxical book about a very paradoxical life. And I wonder, James, if you could begin by giving us a few reflections on the actual life.
Yes. I suppose what's most famous about John Stuart Mill, made famous by his autobiography, perhaps the one thing now that people know, is that he was, until about the age of 14, he was, in a sense, his father's educational possession. I think, as Isaiah Berlin says somewhere, this experiment was an appalling success. His father had him reading Greek at the age of 3, Latin at 7. By 14 or 15, he was writing treatises on economics. And you won't be surprised to know that at the age of 20, and this is recounted in the autobiography, and we will certainly get to it, he has a mental breakdown. He wonders whether life is worth living. He has a real crisis, both intellectual and psychological. But he does pull himself together, and of course goes on to live a life of extraordinary radicalism and boldness. It might not be the sort of revolutionary radicalism of Karl Marx, who I think does not have much time for incremental liberalism like Mill's, but it's just an astonishingly bold life. And reading the autobiography and thinking about Mill, I was struck by quite a lot of connections with the writers that we've been thinking about, with George Eliot's moral courage, with Emerson's theological courage. In fact, there is an Eliot link. George Eliot lives with a man she can't marry, and pays the price socially for that. Mill meets Harriet Taylor as a young man. She's married, but sort of separated from her husband, John Taylor. And for, I think it's 20 years or so, Mill and Harriet Taylor are friends. Even though they travel together, it's a little bit uncertain, a little bit ambiguous, but they're friends until Taylor dies, and they can marry. They're only married for seven and a half years before Harriet Taylor dies. So there are interesting connections, I think, with the radicalism and the courage of writers we've been dealing with. And in Mill's life, we see it not just lived out, of course, domestically, but in his own philosophy, in his work on utilitarianism, his great book on liberty, published in 1859, and also a really impressive public life. He becomes an MP in 1865 for the city of Westminster, and sits in Parliament for 3 years, where, by all accounts, he makes himself thoroughly obnoxious to the ruling Tories. He defends Irish assassins. He prosecutes the horrible governor of Jamaica, who put down a rebellion there brutally. He defends free speech in Hyde Park. He, of course, throughout his career, but in Parliament too, agitates for universal suffrage, which is crucial to his thinking. In all these ways, one just comes away tremendously impressed by Mill's courage and radicalism. He says, I think, in the autobiography, but he says something like, because my father considered religion and Christianity actually to be sort of wicked, I'm probably one of the few people in England who's grown up with total indifference to religion. I mean, not even not he wasn't there wasn't even a sort of Emersonian coming through religion and out the other side. It's dead to him really as a discourse. Um, it's lines like that I absolutely love in Mill.
He was also kind of frighteningly industrious. He didn't have a conventional education, but at the age of 14, he was sent to France, to Montpellier, to study natural science, I think, and to gain the fluency in French, which he enjoyed for the rest of his life. And then a few months later, he comes back at the age of 16 and starts working in the office of the East India Company. And he does that job day in, day out, 48 weeks a year for 35 years, which is that's a lifetime's work as a bureaucrat. And then on top of that, I mean, the amount of writing in his own lifetime, I think he was best known for these two enormous textbooks that he wrote and which came out in edition after edition. One called The System of Logic, which was about how to reason and how to avoid faults in reasoning, and The Principles of Political Economy, which he didn't claim to be particularly original, but it was much easier to make sense of than Adam Smith and Ricardo and the previous economists. And I mean that we tend to forget that. I mean, those bits that are forgotten already make up one of the most productive lives of the Victorian age. And I'd like to pick you up, James, on saying that he wasn't such a radical as Karl Marx. Well, I think in some ways he was much more bold. Karl Marx didn't. I mean, he sometimes tried to address a large audience, but he didn't really succeed very much. Karl Marx was usually writing for people who already agreed with him. And Mill had it as a point of principle to write for people who don't agree with him, and indeed that a good writer is one who disagrees with himself and works things out. And I think in relation to religion, I think it is very interesting what he says about being one of the few people of his generation who never had a problem about religion. You're quite right, James. The other people we've been considering had a huge struggle to get free from religion, and he didn't have that. But then he really did not mince his words. He said, I suppose God might exist, but I do know that Christianity is immoral. It undermines morality because it says the reason you ought to be virtuous is in order to earn your place in heaven, rather than than virtue being, as it were, an end in itself. And if God can punish me for saying that God, if God does exist, and he doesn't like the fact that I think he's immoral, and he wants to send me to hell, Mill says, then to hell I shall go. And that's not the kind of thing that Marx would have said. And equally, I think on the question of women, I mean, you mentioned his agitation for universal suffrage, but
yes,
even from a young age, even from a teenager, he was agitated about the rights of women. And he was saying that...
yes, wasn't he arrested as a teenager for distributing pamphlets about birth control?
Exactly. So. Yes, very interesting about marriage. You're quite right that he did get married, I think, in his 40s, having waited for 10 years for Harriet Taylor to become a favorite. And before he got married, he wrote this sort of binding document saying, I deplore the institution of marriage. I deplore the way it gives me any rights over the woman that I love, and I hereby renounce all these rights. And he was very vehemently anti-slavery, but then he says something like, a slave is not a slave to the same degree as a wife. And again, that's not the kind of thing that Karl Marx would have said. I mean, in some ways, if you only knew, you could do a cross-section or a selection of moments in Mill's life, and he would turn out to be one of the great bohemians of the...
I love that.
That's, the 19th century.
That's so true, and what wonderfully counterintuitive. Yes, I just meant in a sort of classical sense that I suppose that Marx is a revolutionary, at least on paper, and Mill, I suppose, can sound quite like the George Eliot of Middlemarch. When he writes about, I think in the autobiography he says about his father, I think the thing that consoled his father in his last few days was that he left the world a little bit better than he'd found it, and stuff like that. He can sound like the absolutely classic 19th century English liberal. And maybe what you're talking about is honesty. There's an extraordinary honesty that I think perhaps he gets it partly from Tocqueville, but there's a real honesty with struggling with his own radicalism and conservatism. Likewise, both defending and distrusting democracy. But I think somewhere in the autobiography he says something like this. What does he say? He says something. Well, okay. Here's something very bold that I wrote down from the autobiography, and I thought, what an amazingly prescient. We don't think in some ways of Mill as a sort of prophet of what will come in the 20th century. But listen to this line and think how much wisdom is compacted, contemporary wisdom for now is compacted into this line. He said that the following became essential to him: how to unite the greatest individual liberty of action with a common ownership of the raw material of the globe and an equal participation in all the benefits of combined labor. Wowee! Yeah. But what I mean is, and this is part of his great honesty, he can also say at some point, maybe it's in the same passage in the autobiography, something along the lines of, what is it? He says, I didn't really believe in the revolutionary stuff about the emancipation of the working classes, but I thought it was important to say that in order that the ruling classes could come to realize that they had more to lose from an uneducated working class than an educated working class. It's something like that. It's a striking moment where he sort of confesses, as I guess he does throughout the autobiography, that he's always led towards the Saint-Simonians, Kant, and then there's a backing away when they get too systematic or they start. Do you know what I mean? There's some.
Maybe true. I mean, one thing that's striking is that throughout his life, I mean, from a very early age, he did say that he basically was in favor of socialism,
Yes.
which you tend not to remember. I think that one of the things he intervened several times in his life on the question of what to make of the legacy of the French Revolution, which obviously was it was throughout the 19th century, it was almost as contested as the question of the existence of God. And he says something very interesting about the French Revolution, which was that the ideals were wonderful, but in order to create a social revolution, you actually have to prepare the minds of the masses of people. And you can't just have a vanguard class proclaiming a revolution if the people are not ready for it. And I mean, in some ways, I think a classical Marxist would have to say the same. I think there's another thing, actually, to rather change the subject, that gets in the way of recognizing what an inspiring and unusual and bold figure Mill was, that we tend to have an image of him, literally an image. My copy of the autobiography has a reproduction of this painting by G.F. Watts. It's a rather beautiful painting of this very austere, knobbly-headed, rather cross-looking old man. I didn't realize till I looked it up that it was painted a few weeks before Mill died. And there's a wonderful. One of the other paradoxes of Mill's life is that he had, at some points, an incredibly close relationship with Thomas Carlyle.
Yes.
Who is, is kind of the opposite in terms of both personal and literary style. Carlyle remembers meeting Mill when Mill was in his 20s, and he described him as an innocent young creature with rich auburn hair. And that's what I call rich auburn hair, and a gentle expression, and beautiful to contemplate. I think Carlyle was quite a connoisseur of male beauty, and Mill was a looker. He was very attractive, and I think that. I don't think he was conscious of that. I can't imagine him spending much time looking in a mirror. But he had an effect on people as a really alluring individual, which we tend to forget, partly because of this wonderful portrait of him practically on his deathbed.
Yes.
He wasn't always on his deathbed.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription.